So once you take a step back and say, okay, let's go back to the beginning. Like, what do we want to accomplish as a company? And then go through of like, what's our current process of how we even do that? What system is involved? Okay, what data can we collect? And like start leveraging it that way. And then you can fine tune that data experience. Whereas it's data is such an exciting thing that people want it now, want it today. And that system data connection is the easiest way, but it's the one that gets in the way the most. Specifically with that team, it's definitely a different scenario for anyone that gets to start it from the beginning, where there's no real data structure and you build it from the ground up, which is where we were at there. And seeing what the company's now doing with that information is phenomenal. The part that we got to that was a little difficult was we started to get too many people, as the saying goes, like too many cooks in the kitchen, where we wanted to make sure everyone's aligned. And in so doing, we brought everyone together, but that actually created more noise. So if I look back and I have that conversation, one, I still believe it's fundamental to have a data dictionary. So everyone knows the same terms, they're talking the same language. But then you definitely need a centralized individual that kind of runs point on that data process, that data strategy that everyone can trust. That's the other part, is like it's the trust of that individual. And my last company, we were getting there. There's an individual there now that's really pushing for it. But there was still so many people involved in how we create data, how we use data, that it was just a roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. And so once we were able to remove those, saying, okay, great, we're going to partner with you, but this is our data expert, this is our data individual. That's where we were able to actually jump to the next level to use the data day-to-day in business decisions.
That's a great nuance, right? Because when I speak to other RevOps, SalesOps folks, they talk about you need to bring people in. We're clearly saying here you can bring too many people in. In my mind, the interesting challenge that might throw up is, how do you give people a sense that they're being listened to, they're having agency over the process, over the data? How do you bring them in so they actually like follow it, if you can't necessarily bring everyone's ideas onto the table?
Yeah, and the way I look at it is you can bring too many people in if you do not clearly, and it's, basic opposite for people. If you're not defining proper accountability, that's where you bring too many people in. Right. So when we brought people in, we had somebody that was the accountable for the group, who was our kind of data individual. And then each executive or each individual came in was accountable for their own data. The problem there was, if our marketing individual had different idea than the client success individual, it was very different. So where we built the structure instead is we changed the perception of how we were talking to that team. So data individual was actually accountable for the quality of all data. And then those people that came in now became accountable for the execution of what was discovered, right? So they were still involved, saying, hey, I need to look at this. This is coming up. Help me, go, how could we look at this in the future? And then that accountability would go to that data person. They'd get it all cleaned up, and then they'd pass that back. So there was a clearly defined kind of accountability map of where things need to go. And that's how we brought everyone back in, because they knew to do their part later on, they had to partner with this individual, which is where that became effective.
Yeah, okay. So that's almost thinking about there, like the strategy of the data cleanliness project, but then handing it off to the tactics of how that's implemented.
Yeah, so as we talk about even now, where I'm at now, because I don't get to build it from the ground up, I inherited what's there. But when I look at it, the fundamental thing that we came to, there's an operational flow that I stole from a conference from Hillary Headley years ago from Zoom. And it's a basic flow, and I think she stole from somebody else. It's just trained of stealing it from people. It's, you start with strategy, you go to planning, you go to process, you go to systems, you go to data, you go to insights, and then that helps you start back at strategy. Most of the times when we're talking data, we are jumping straight to the end, where it's actually data in the process of, okay, we need more data. And you see it like kind of a backward step of like, oh, well, if we don't have the data, let's go stare at the systems. Like, okay, let's stare at the systems. And that's where a lot of new companies, you get, inundated on data issues of so many fields in Salesforce that people aren't really using, because everyone's like, oh, I need this data point. Okay, well, we can do it in the system, create it. And they just do that one little section of that entire wheel. So once you take a step back and say, okay, let's go back to the beginning. Like, what do we want to accomplish as a company? And then go through of like, what's our current process of how we even do that? What system is involved? Okay, what data can we collect? And like, start leveraging it that way. And then you can fine tune that data experience. Whereas it's data is such an exciting thing that people want it now, want it today. And that system data connection is the easiest way, but it's the one that gets in the way the most.
Yeah, okay, that's if we take a step back from this, it's really interesting. So it actually has an effect on what role a rev or sales ops person plays in the org, right? And there's different ways this works. Some folks, they're head down in the tactical and they're executing. To have your kind of approach that you're describing, it sounds like we need to have a link to decision makers. We need to be in those strategic conversations. So like, how does the RevOps team, the people leading this, actually tune into those strategic discussions at the top, so that you can then implement it tactically?
So it's unique because when you look at how ops fits in, you have individuals that want to be at the table, some that are, some that aren't, and kind of that space of, all those conversations. How do we get there? And a lot of these times in that, like that wheel that I share, you don't actually have to be at the table to impact that conversation. What you have to understand is that there's more to it. So a simple, you know, if you can create your brand where if you ask me for something, I can say, okay, why, or what's the company objective we're trying to, solve with this? And you learn to ask questions, you get back to that strategy. Now, I may not be involved in the strategy conversation, but I could easily say, if I'm not at the table, like, okay, this sounds like it is something that's impacting the company, not just a quick ask, like something that someone just thought up over the weekend and would be cool to look at. So that starts that conversation. And if somebody's doing that frequent enough, they start to get brought into the strategic conversations of like, hey, we've noticed you're pushing back, you're moving up. For those that are in the strategic conversations, it's just making sure that like, what are your company objectives? So you need to be able to rattle off, ideally, this is what we're working towards, this is our focus, kind of go through them. So when a question comes up, you can help, get to the point of, hey, does this, like, how would you relate this to this? And you get to a quicker conversation versus having them build it back to what they think the strategy is.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. This is kind of in the world here of the difference between a rev or sales ops person who just provides the information, they just provide data or report, and people actually use that data and information to impact the strategy that's happening.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, okay, that's awesome. So this is cool because we've got like you had two different approaches here between data cleanliness. Is it that you just learn things from the first time that you're taking into the second time? Or are there like distinct differences in the actual problems that require different approaches?
I will always learn from my experiences. I like to look back and, definitely if I failed, failing's the quickest way to learn. So things I did wrong, I'm not going to do again. But the environments are very, very different. So as I talked about, I went from really nothing in place, no real roadblocks, just data didn't fully exist to build that out, to where I am now is, Salesforce and all of our technology was owned by engineering. It's a very engineering-led company where I'm at now. And it's a completely different approach of that system, and data for the most part is already in place, but it comes back to what's the quality, what's the usability, like how much of this really matters to our business. So we're in a state that I would call, realistically, it's data overload. Like we are drowning in data. It's data paralysis to the point where we've created so much because people wanted it, and we have all these talented technical individuals like, oh, I can create that, like I can throw it in there. That for us to now change and scale as an organization and get better data is months and months of work. So it is different this time around in the sense of I don't have to just direct. We're not just directing. We are reevaluating everything and having to strip back that entire process, which is difficult when you go into someone and say, hey, you built this beautiful masterpiece that, I think is ugly. Like it needs to change. It needs to be fixed. And so it's handling those conversations in a professional manner and a quick manner that we can go back and answer the process and strategy question before we start executing and distributing all the data to everybody, because we really are just running in circles of looking at random data points that aren't really impacting the business.
Yeah, right. That's a really good point. And I suppose for people interested in data, they love it, right? But you have to make that actionable for sales reps ultimately, for silo leads. And it sounds like you've understood that really well. But how does that explanation piece work when you're explaining maybe to a tech person or an engineer, like actually this is what a sales rep needs? How does that conversation piece turn out? How do you make that work?
So I like to take things from other individuals and use my own.
Yeah.
quite a while ago, someone shared an example of a plane in World War II. So some planes were coming back with bullet holes in it. They were like, we should look at the data to figure out where to strengthen our planes. And a mathematician was like, hey, well, what about where these planes weren't hit because these planes came back? Like, what should we know about the story of the ones not coming back? And that's where they understood the data told a different story than what was really going on. And that's where I came in, and it was kind of we're so heavy on that data that I share examples like that. And I love to share anything visual, because I feel like no matter what role you're in, if you can get some sort of visual explanation, like a comparison, they start to understand. Culturally, it helps too if you can find something that fits with the different cultures. But in sharing those types of conversations of look, you guys are so focused on where these bullet holes are, have we taken a step back to see why we're not getting what we need? Like, what's the story behind why they're still not performing? And that's the conversation that's really changed the way we're looking, is they haven't fully been in seat. They haven't sat with the reps and figured out what's going on. So they literally were fixing based on these data points that weren't telling the full story. So part of my job is helping them see the full story, getting them to the people that can tell them the full story, and then just letting them know data is not always the answer. It's the starting point for you to then figure out the next step to go to see what really has to happen.
Yeah, that's awesome. If you manage to visualize it in the right way, you'll have the correct actions following on from it.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. What I want to tackle now is, I think if lots of people in sales and RevOps are like really candid, what they'd probably say is our data hygiene is such a mammoth task. I feel it with my own team, and anyone who's tried to outreach to anyone about data will hear it's in such a mess, this is going to take forever, and it's just not priority right now. How do you break that down into something actionable, Branden? Like, how did you get going with it? Because you've done this twice. How did you get going with it? How did you break it down?
That's a great question. For me, when I look at it, is you will never be perfect with data, and it's so overwhelming. Like, it's being candid, for my feeling, it's one of the worst parts of the job, is you have to do so much off the data, yet data will never be perfect, and you can always find flaws. So when I look at an organization, it's kind of twofold. So like where I'm starting right now is going back to, if I were to look at the data points that really matter, what are the top 20 data points that we have to rely on very, very accurately? And then what's kind of my second tier? That if it's 70-80%, we still have enough information to make decisions. We just have, we know there's going to be room for error as we, work to clean it up, or just leave it at that kind of status quo. And then work your way down to, we never use this and get rid of it. Just kind of a high level view of the importance of your data. And then you can start prioritizing. So if I have 300 fields, I may really only spend the time cleaning up 10 of them that are the most impactful to the organization, that has to be very reliable. But anytime I talk to you on an ops, we always get the pressure of every data point, that if one data point, everything's wrong. So that's where it comes back to the visualization, the information. And I think it's, even if it's like a verification, identifier, or a system cleanup record of what you're doing and how you're doing it, that visibility is where you build that trust of, even if I have 200 fields that aren't reliable, if they can come in and say, okay, these 10 fields, this was what we did to make them more accurate, this is how we're keeping them more accurate, and this is the date it started, that's where you start to get more confidence in how you're interacting. And that could just be an email that people can reference. It can be, a Slack, whatever it is, or an official document. But that's where you start, is what matters most? How can people start relying on that? And then as you start adding things in, because they trust you on those fields, they'll start to trust you as you add more fields in, and take away from the, hey, you're right, we haven't really updated any of those. Like, we'll work on it. Just if you ever use it, use your own, discrepancy. These are the ones that are going to be reliable, and you just keep on adding to that list.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. I want us to follow on from that, but first of all, time check. Are you okay for a few more minutes, Branden?
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Okay. So when I step back and reflect about this, it's cool because data, it's an empirical thing, it's scientific, but actually, I think what you're advocating here is a mindset shift in how we view data and how we tell a story with data, and what it's useful for, which is basically get going with it. Like, it's useful for something. Would you say that's like a fair summary of how we make data effective?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to it is there's a fine line when we tell a story, is you can tell any story you want with any data, right? I could look at 3 data points versus 10, and make it look like something was a positive for the quarter. Yet when you look at all 10, it's very negative. So the second part of it is controlling who gets to tell the story, right? You need someone unbiased to help with that, which is why operations become so important. If you can create that relationship with operations and your stakeholders, because you can challenge the story they're telling. You can add additional context that they may not be looking at, or just provide them what they need for the full context. And that's where decision, like that's where you get the seat at the table. If I'm really challenging the story with real life examples, real life data, versus our CMO who might go and pitch the board on, we had the most amazing quarter, yet there's no actual results from it. It's that part too. Is it's not just creating it so people can tell the story, but it's creating it in a way where you can challenge the story with accurate information.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because you might see your average deal value double, but then your sales cycle triple. So it might look really good, but without the context, it actually doesn't look so great as you might think.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, okay, that's really cool. On that point of telling a story, I suppose it's true that people in ops are almost like translators for data. They look at the data and they help translate what that actually means. Sales leaders, CROs, the board, they're busy folks. They're not necessarily as well versed in data as someone in ops might be. So how do you handle that crucial communication and translation between the data you're seeing and the correct story and the correct context?
Yeah, that's a fun one, because I believe it depends on the personality of the leaders you're working with. I've worked with leaders that do understand data, so it's a matter of just getting it to them. And if they can feel confident that it's there on time, it's accurate, whatever it is, that's all they need, right? They'll be able to make good decisions. Then you have those that might be really good at coaching, but are horrible at interpreting data. The problem is, as an ops individual, we're here to help, but we cannot be the de facto point of data analysis. We can't be the one staring at everything all day every day and telling them what to do. A lot of these leaders are paid very good money to execute their business, so it becomes a part of enablement. If you have a leader that's very lacking in how they understand data and how they use it, that's just the time to say, okay, our enablement, our coaching for these types of leaders needs to be helping them see bigger pictures with data. Now, still, we're going to be involved, but the goal is to build them up to where they also can say, hey, I have all of my data, I have the proper story, but you work very closely with them until you get to that point. And that's really what you're going to see. You have those that are really good data, and you just become a partner on additional projects, different insights, and you're still looking at the data yourself. So I might find things that quicker than they do, and I'll still surface it, but they're not relying on me to bring everything to their attention. Like that's not opportunity for growth. But if we can get each leader to feel comfortable enough understanding beyond just the basic pipeline metrics, if they can start to sit down, and the part is too, like, you don't want them to spend 8 hours. Like, if it's a deep project, give it to ops, give it to your analyst, whatever it is. But if it's hey, I'm going to sit down for 30 minutes, look at my business, hey, here's 5 things that could be impacting my business, and they can tell that story deeper and very quickly, that's where you're going to get good decisions. And it's not a deep, and that's the problem is most data, when people want to make changes, it's a deep audit, but most of the time you don't need a deep audit. You need consistent high level metrics to start making those decisions, and then you start seeing the impact of those decisions and make changes. Versus if we had ops do an audit on every time we did something, one project would take 3 months, and we'd never know if it was actually valuable in time if we're trying to scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why it's a good segue into one of my closing questions. And it's the success measurement. How do you think you're going about measuring the success of this project? And there's so many different ways. It's not just how clean the data is. There's also what kind of impact it has, and it's also what kind of engagement it gets from sales leaders and sales reps. So how do you measure success in those 3 crucial areas?
Yeah. For where I'm at today, I'm taking a slightly different approach for this company. One is the basically the reduction of time to get to decision, from idea to decision. Right now, something might be weeks. We're pulling things into spreadsheets, validating it, just kind of moving things around, recomparing it. That a simple analysis that I would have done in my last company to take 5 minutes is now taking 5 days. So the time to value is one that we're looking at, and that's difficult to report because you're taking assumptions on, well, here's on average how long it takes, but you can get a high level view of, yeah, normally this project would have taken 5 days. It's now taking 1 day. That's a success. Like we're cutting that down. For managers, it's the way we're looking at it now is it's showing through coaching. The more they're understanding their data, the better they're coaching their managers. So our VPs, the better they're coaching their managers, the better the managers are coaching their reps, which are then impacting our final number. So we are using some baseline pipeline metrics, for us SQLs, full pipeline progression, like using those types of metrics to say, okay, is what they're doing matter on a consistent basis? Do they have the right information to pivot their organization? So that's another one. And then the third one is, this is not one I add value to, but it's more of a reflective point, is prioritization. So when you're getting good data, you watch projects that would normally have been prioritized now be pushed away or on the back burner, because the data is so valid and so rich that you really know what the problem is, not making assumptions. So if you can start seeing that you're refocusing your work from, day-to-day repetitive tasks to strategic conversations that are actually moving the business, that's the sign that you've been able to go back and get data into the right format that it can be used as an organization.
Yeah, that's a great closing point. That's when you'll know you'll be successful in ops, is when your data project is actually influencing strategy, which is where probably most folks want to get to, I think.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, nice. Awesome. Actually, a final closing question. It opens up a good one for me. It's the difference between being a builder in ops, so someone who's just supplying the data. I've already talked about this, but someone who's just supplying data and insights, and then someone who's actually seeing those having an effect on the ground. Just reflect on me the differences between those two positions, what that feels like to be in one or the other.
Depends on the day, on how I feel where I'm at. Some days I feel like I'm just providing data. Others, it still feels like, even today, still feels like I'm, at the table at some points. Really where I felt the difference, and it's hard in ops a lot of times, you don't get appreciation for what you do in a lot of projects you work on. The shift that I saw, and it was kind of an aha moment for me a few years ago, is I actually started building out the sales and marketing analytics function at my last company. So we didn't have anyone in seat. I wasn't even in ops yet, but it was purely analytics. Like we needed our board slides, we needed everything going in. And it was very reactive of, hey, we need this, we need this, we need this. And I remember I don't remember if I read something, but I took a step back, and this was probably, 5-6 years ago. And I was like, I want to do more. Like, I'm so sick of just taking requests. Like, I want to start giving ideas. And I did. Nothing really happened out of it. I was giving ideas. Nothing really happened. And moved into ops. Still nothing was really going on. But I remember one day, was it our head of sales came to me and was like, hey, I have a problem. Can you help figure it out? And like the way the question was worded, it wasn't, I need these reports to make a decision. It was, what should we do? Like, how should we answer that question? And it hit me like, hey, did I just make it? Like, did I finally get to the point where I'm no longer seeing it as just a data puller? I'm actually a strategic partner in this data analysis. Now, the next day, I got a repetitive request and I had to do it. But there's this fluctuation. Even when you have that seat at the table, there's still gonna be that fluctuation where it's like, hey, we just need this, just deliver on it. And you can question it saying, hey, what's going on? Like, yeah, just deliver. And you're like, fine, we'll deliver, like, give what you need. But when the questions are no longer around, can you get me this report? It's, we have this problem. Can you help us validate it and give ideas, right? Can you take it to the next level? And you're put into the process, not you're just a little off note back into the person who is helping it. It definitely feels great, but at the same time, I mean, anyone wanting that, it's they have to know it comes with greater accountability. You're now responsible for, if you recommended something and we do it, you're now accountable for the success in it, right? Whereas before, you give a report and you walk away and you're like, okay, well, if they make a bad decision and the company goes down, I'm not a part of it. So that is one caveat, is once you start getting brought into the process, you start hearing those conversations of, how do we solve it? What are your thoughts? Like, you've added enough value that they're listening and they want to listen when you speak. Like that's kind of the key thing, is they don't have to take your ideas, but to be a good ops person, you need to get people to listen. Like, even if it's not to your ideas, but if you can help them listen to all of the data points, to all of the stories, that's where it becomes a valuable ops individual, is facilitating that conversation.